It's Not a Boy. Sunnyside. Chapter 2, Part 2. Creak! There it was again. This time I was sure there was a little shadow like a bird fluttering, but after that everything was silent again. I was getting a bit nervous, so I hastily shoved everything back and crept quietly downstairs. My mam was still with Auntie Peggy in their kitchen, and they were whispering. "What did I miss?" asked Auntie Peggy. "I should have married him." "But you couldn't. Auntie Dolly said no, no," answered Mam, leaning forward and holding Auntie Peggy's hand. "I should have stood up to her. I would now." I didn't hear Mam's answer because I had skipped off down the garden on my own. But I wasn't on my own. Disaster had struck, because great Auntie Dilly had come out in the garden as well. I could see her bobbing along, and I could hear her nasal call. She was following me. I ran along the path where the wet poppies flopped on my socks, and I brushed past them. I ran to the bottom of the garden where the little bantam hens laid their eggs. I ran past the vegetables and on faster and faster, but whenever I turned, she was still in hot pursuit and gaining on me. I ran on again. My plan was to escape onto Green Lane. Out of breath, I stopped at the gate which led to my freedom, and I turned to look at her. She was half hidden by a pear tree, but I could see her face, and she was smiling a wide, gappy smile. "Boo!" she said gently, and she was laughing and peeping at me. I knew how to answer her now. I needn't have bothered to run away. "Boo!" I answered, and I laughed, relieved. This was easy. But I hadn't got off so lightly. "Goo, gaw, gee," she said, holding out her hand towards me. Desperately I pretended I understood and nodded my head. But she knew that I didn't understand. "You, gaw, gee," she insisted. So this time I looked straight at her and just pretended I hadn't heard a thing. But she was too clever for that trick. "You, gaw, gee," she said again, even louder. And then it struck me that shadow that I'd seen when I was poking around in that suitcase must have been great Auntie Dilly. That creak must have been her brown shoes on the floorboard. She'd seen everything. Mum always said that when you were deaf, then your sight got better by comparison. It must have been true, because even though Auntie Dolly hadn't seen me, Auntie Dilly had seen me go upstairs, and she must have followed me. I was frightened. I licked my lips. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have been doing that. I shouldn't have looked in the suitcase, and I shouldn't have looked in the purse. I won't ever do it again." I did actions, hanging my head and holding, but she was still holding her hand out. And come to think of it, she didn't look cross. In fact, she was still smiling her big, gappy smile. And suddenly I wondered why she was holding her hand out. I looked, and in her palm was that farthing, that brown wren snuggled against her warm, wrinkled skin. I watched her face, and she was smiling even more and pushing that flat palm towards me. "You, ha, e." She sent her words to me with great effort, nodding her head with every sound that came out of her nose, but she kept smiling and holding that precious coin out to me. "For me," I mouthed, wide-eyed and pointing to myself. She nodded, and I went towards her and picked up the farthing carefully between my finger and thumb. Oh, I would always treasure this. I turned it over in my hand to look at the brown wren and then the strict king. Like Dilly and Dolly, two sides of the same coin. I held it tight in my hand and smiled. But great Auntie Dilly wanted me to look at something more. In her other hand she held that little black velvet purse covered in poppies. She brushed it gently on her hollow cheek, and then she pretended to hold a needle in her hand and pretended to thread it and did some pretend embroidery. "You did that," I mouthed again, pointing to her and then to the embroidery, and she nodded and nodded and smiled, and then she nodded again. It was then that she stopped smiling and held out the old photograph. It was of the handsome man in uniform. "Is that Henry?" I shouted, and she looked at me sadly, and I knew that it was. Then she put it back in her purse, and off she flew down the path towards their house in her little brown shoes. I followed her, and I grinned because I was pleased with myself. Because even though I was a bit sad about that handsome man, I thought it was all a very long time ago. But you see, I'd been able to tell what Great Auntie Dilly was saying, and I could add that now to my What I Am Good At list. I'd cracked a secret code somehow. I was thrilled, and of course I had my little farthing to treasure forever. I burst into the house. "Look at what Auntie Dilly gave me," I shouted, and I ran excitedly to Mam. "You can't take that. You know you must never take money from anybody. Give it back." She took my precious coin from my hand. "Gee, gaw, gee, goo, gee," said Great Auntie Dilly, bobbing about. I could tell what she meant. She was saying, "I gave it to her." I was so pleased with myself, I wondered why I ever didn't know what she was saying. I was surprised I ever found it difficult. But Mam couldn't tell what she was saying, and she pushed the coin back into Great Auntie Dilly's hand. "She has given it to her. She wants her to have it," said Auntie Peggy. And Great Auntie Dilly nodded and nodded, so much that I thought her head would come off her little neck. Then she gave me the farthing back, and I put it in my pocket where it was safe, and everything was all right again. But one day, when I went to Sunnyside, everything wasn't all right. My Great Auntie Dilly was not there. She wasn't in the garden digging up plants. She wasn't in the kitchen turning the oven up. She wasn't in the front room sitting by the fire in a little chair. My Mam said that she had crossed over, and that meant that she would not be coming back. Sunnyside had changed forever, and even Great Auntie Dolly could not make it better by saying, "No, no, that would never do." Her beloved sister was buried in the Methodist graveyard. She was wearing her little brown leather shoes. Auntie Dilly had gone, but Auntie Dolly hadn't. Well, they were opposites after all, and now Great Auntie Dolly just slumped in a chair by the fire, which suddenly seemed too much for her. Even her rings lost their sparkle, and she stared at the empty seat opposite, and sometimes when she thought no one was looking, but I was, and so was the little wren on the mantelpiece, she got that little black poppy purse out of her handbag and looked at it and gently brushed it against her hairy cheek. I sometimes wondered if Great Auntie Dolly ever thought about Henry and Peggy. I wondered if she was sorry that she had parted them, now she knew what it was like to lose someone you love. Now when we went to Sunnyside, Mam talked a bit to Auntie Peggy, and I sometimes ran aimlessly round the garden, but mostly we just sat in their front room with Great Auntie Dolly and that empty little chair. We did nothing and said nothing, while Dolly shrivelled before our eyes. Her spare skin dropped in folds around her ankles. Then one day, while I was running aimlessly round their garden again with nothing to do, an old man with grey hair came down Green Lane. He opened the gate and went up the path. He knocked gently, and I stood there behind the pear tree to see what happened next. Auntie Peggy opened the door, and there was silence. Then she shrieked. "Oh, Henry!" she shouted. "Henry!" And she put her arms round him. I must say I was a bit disappointed with this Henry. He was not one bit good looking like in the photograph, now he was older and not in uniform. But Auntie Peggy didn't seem to mind, and Henry came to stay in Ringham. And he went every day to Sunnyside to dig the garden and help look after great Auntie Dolly. My mum and Auntie Peggy talked and talked in the kitchen. "What did I miss? Tell me it all." "I can't, I'm too embarrassed. You'll have to find out for yourself." "I will soon," laughed Auntie Peggy with her new wide-mouthed laugh. They got married at Ringham Methodist Chapel. The new young vicar didn't seem to mind that he had already been divorced. And in any case, Mam said that things were different these days. Auntie Dolly didn't go to the wedding, of course. She stayed at Sunnyside, staring at that little empty chair. But at least she didn't say no this time. Perhaps she knew better. I went to the wedding, and I must say that I was sorry to see that Auntie Peggy didn't wear a big white dress. She wore a simple brown suit, which Mam said was probably more appropriate in the circumstances. Even so, I thought that she looked very dull. But Uncle Henry didn't seem to mind. He just stared into the eyes of his new bride. After the wedding, they hurried back to Sunnyside. When I went to see them, they were looking after Auntie Dolly as best they could. They put thicker shawls round her and fluffier slippers on her feet. But Dolly just got colder and colder. I watched them make her lovely tempting meals from the fruit in the garden and from the vegetables, and they served her eggs sunny side down just as she liked them. But I saw the rings fall off her skinny fingers, and Uncle Henry put them on the ivy leaf for the little wren to look after. After Auntie Peggy stopped smoking, the little wren had been quite lonely, but now it had the rings, and Dolly didn't even notice. In fact, she stopped noticing everything until one day Mum told me that great Auntie Dolly had crossed over, and she was with Dilly again at last. They buried her in her fluffy slippers next to her sister Dilly, and it says on their grave, "Dolly and Dilly, together again, never more to be parted." Auntie Peggy thought of that saying, and I thought it was very good because it meant Peggy and Henry as well. There were a lot more changes at Sunnyside after that, and there was nobody to say, no, that would never do. But some things stayed exactly the same, because the big bright poppies seeded everywhere. And they grew and grew again, and there were hundreds of them, and they were flowering and flowering on both sides of the path.